The night was cold, colder than most nights the human had known on this alien world. Snow drifted across the silent valley, and the wind howled through the cracks of the wooden cabin. Inside, the man sat alone by the fire, a cup of weak broth. In his hands he had lived this way for many months in silence, far from the noise of cities and wars. But that night, something unusual broke the quiet, a sound that made him freeze. A knock, sharp and desperate, echoing through the wooden door. At first, he thought it was only the wind pushing against the wood, but then, again, the knock came, louder this time. 3 quick hits, then silence, then another weak knock, as if the hand outside had no strength left. His heart quickened, for no one ever came this far. Travelers avoided the mountain road in winter, and locals never dared climb this high. He placed the cup aside and stood, every step toward the door feeling heavier than the last. The knocking grew softer, fading, almost like a plea. He reached the door and pressed his hand against it. "Who's there?" he called, his voice rough after days without speaking. For a moment only silence answered him, broken by the howl of the storm. Then faint, trembling words came through the wood. "Please, please open, my children. They are freezing." The man's blood chilled more than the snow outside. Children, out here in the storm? He pulled the lock and pushed the door open. The wind rushed in, carrying with it flakes of snow that bit into his skin. And standing there half collapsed in the doorway was a figure, a woman, tall, slender, her skin pale with a strange faint glow, her eyes large and wet with tears. Her arms wrapped tight around 2 small children clinging to her. They shivered violently, their breaths ragged in the icy air. The human stared, unable to speak. She was not one of his kind, that much was clear. Her features were too sharp, her hair a silver white that shimmered under the moonlight. The children looked the same, though smaller, weaker, their faces buried in her torn cloak. The woman fell to her knees, holding them close. Her voice cracked as she lifted her head to him. "Please, I beg you, take us in. They will die out here." For a heartbeat, the man did not move. He had heard rumors, whispers in the market town below. Alien widows abandoned after the war, left to starve in the wild. But he had never seen one with his own eyes, and now here she was, kneeling at his door, offering her broken strength. Something inside him ached at the sight, the way her thin arms shook, the way her children clung to her, as if she were the last thing in their world. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in," he said quickly, his voice firmer than he felt. The woman gathered the children and stumbled forward, nearly collapsing as she crossed the threshold. The man closed the door against the storm, and the sudden silence inside pressed heavily on them all. The fire crackled in the corner, its light casting shadows across the small room. The children's eyes darted to it, their faces pale and hollow with hunger. The woman sank down, onto the floor, clutching them close. Tears ran down her face, and she whispered words he almost didn't hear. "I will do anything. Anything you ask. Only give them warmth. Give them life." Her words struck him like a blade. She wasn't only asking for shelter. She was offering herself. In her voice was both pride and desperation, as if she had been forced to say these words before. The man's hands trembled. He knelt by the fire, grabbed another log, and threw it on, sparks flying into the air. The flame rose higher, filling the cabin with heat. He glanced back at her and said, "First, warm them by the fire, then we'll speak." The woman obeyed at once, pulling the children close to the flames. Their small hands reached toward the warmth, their eyes wide with silent wonder. The man watched them, his chest tight. He had lived alone for so long, avoiding the cries of the world. Yet tonight those cries had come to his door, breaking through the walls he had built, and he could not turn them away. Outside, the wind howled like a beast, clawing at the wooden walls, but inside the fire burned. The widow whispered comfort to her children, and the human sat silently, knowing his life had just changed forever. The knock in the frozen night was only the beginning. The fire glowed, warmly, but the room felt heavy with silence. The man sat on his chair, his eyes fixed on the alien widow and her children. They were huddled close to the flames, their bodies trembling less now, but their faces still pale. The children leaned against their mother, too weak to speak, too tired to cry. The woman's cloak was ragged, her hair damp with melting snow, and her eyes carried a weight that made his chest tighten. Finally, she lifted her head, her lips parted, and her voice came out soft and broken. "My mate, he was killed in the war," she whispered, her hand brushing her children's heads. "Since then we have wandered. No home, no food, no help, only doors shut in our faces." Her words cut through the quiet like blades. The man looked at her and saw not only a widow but a fighter, carrying 2 lives in arms too thin to bear such weight. She swallowed hard, her voice trembling as she forced out more. "I came here tonight because I had no choice. My children cannot last another night in the cold. Please, human, let us stay." The man felt his throat tighten, but before he could speak, she leaned forward suddenly, her eyes desperate. "I will do anything for you," she said quickly, her voice rising with fear. "I will serve you, clean your home, work your land, even your bed. Only give them shelter. Only let them live." The words struck him harder than he expected. He stared at her, stunned by the rawness of her plea. The fire crackled between them, the only sound for a long moment. The man had seen hunger before. He had seen desperation too, but never spoken like this. Never with such naked honesty. Her children clung tighter to her sides, too young to understand the meaning of her words, yet old enough to feel her fear. He rubbed his hands over his face, breathing deeply. His life had been quiet, lonely, safe from others' pain. But now, here in his cabin, pain had walked straight in. And it had a name, it had faces, it had voices that begged him not to turn away. "Why me?" he finally asked, his voice low. "There are others in the valley, other homes. Why my door?" The widow shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "Because you are human," she whispered. "You're kind. You fight. But you also show mercy. My people told me humans are different, and I prayed tonight that mercy would live here." The man's heart thudded in his chest. He had not thought of himself as merciful, only tired, only broken, only someone hiding from a world that had taken too much already. But to her he was hope. He stood and paced near the fire, unsure if he could bear the weight she was placing on his shoulders. Her words wrapped around him, heavy, inescapable. The widow lowered her head, her voice dropping to a whisper. "If you send us away, we will not survive. If you keep us, I swear by my life I will give all I have left to you." Her hands trembled as she pressed her children closer, her tears falling onto their small foreheads. The children stirred weakly, one of them opening wide, luminous eyes to look at the man. The gaze pierced him deeper than the storm ever could. It was the gaze of innocence, of trust not yet broken. The man felt something shift inside him. Loneliness had been his companion for so long, but now, sitting across from him was something stronger. Need life, a chance to protect. He clenched his fists, torn between fear of what this choice could bring and the unbearable thought of opening his door to throw them back into the storm. The fire popped, sending sparks into the air. The widow flinched at the sound, her arms tightening around her children. The man saw how fragile they were, yet how fiercely she held on to them. Her strength and weakness lived side by side, and he realized that her plea was not only for survival, but for dignity. She was willing to sacrifice herself so her children could live. At last he spoke, his voice steady but heavy with decision. "You and your children can stay," he said. "Not because of what you offer, but because no one deserves to freeze at my door." The widow gasped, her eyes wide, shimmering. With sudden light, tears spilled freely down her face and she pressed her forehead to the floor, whispering in broken words of thanks. Her children stirred, curling closer to the fire, their small faces softening as sleep pulled them away from the hunger and cold. The man watched them, his chest aching in ways he had not felt for years. For the first time, his cabin no longer felt empty, but he also knew this choice had broken something inside him. The walls he had built to keep the world away were now shattered, And outside, beyond the cabin walls, danger waited. He did not know it yet, but the moment he opened his door, the storm that entered was larger than snow and wind. The cabin smelled of burning wood and warm broth. The fire still burned bright, throwing shadows across the walls. The widow sat close to the flames, her children pressed against her sides, their eyes finally heavy with sleep. The man moved quietly around the room, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He poured what little broth was left into 3 small bowls, placing them on the table. The children stirred when the smell reached them, their noses twitching like small animals. One of them peeked up with wide, glowing eyes, then quickly looked away as if ashamed to want food so badly. The man's chest tightened. He walked over, knelt by the fire, and held out a bowl to the widow. "Feed them first," he said softly. Her hands shook as she accepted the bowl. She whispered something in her alien tongue, perhaps a thank you, perhaps a prayer. She broke the bread he had saved, dipping it into the broth and pressing it gently to her children's lips. They bit eagerly, too hungry to wait, broth running down their chins as they chewed. The man watched, in silence, his stomach twisting. He had eaten enough to be full earlier, but now he wished he had given more to them. When the bowls were empty, the children curled against their mother, drifting into sleep. The widow stroked their hair slowly, her eyes distant as if she were both here and far away. The man finally broke the silence. "You should rest too," he said. "There's a bed upstairs. I'll sleep by the fire." Her head lifted sharply, her expression unreadable. "No," she whispered, her voice firm. "You gave us life tonight. I will give back to you." Her eyes flicked toward the small bed in the corner. "I will warm your bed," she said quietly. "That is the bargain I made when I knocked on your door." The man's breath caught. He had known those words would come again, but hearing them now in his cabin made him uneasy. He looked at her, her silver hair tangled, her cheeks hollow, her hands trembling. She was offering herself not out of love, not even desire, but out of desperation. And yet, there was dignity in the way she said it, as though she would rather give everything of herself than admit defeat. He shook his head slowly. "No bargain," he said firmly. "I don't take payment in flesh." Her lips parted in shock, her eyes glistening as if she had not expected mercy to stretch so far. For a long moment she stared at him, then lowered her gaze. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Then, you are not like the others." The word struck deep, but before he could ask what she meant, the fire cracked loudly, and one of the children whimpered in their sleep. She bent down quickly, stroking their head, whispering soft words in her alien tongue until they stilled. The man stood watching, a strange feeling growing in his chest. These were strangers in his house, yet the sight of them here felt strangely right. As if the cabin had been waiting for this moment, waiting to be filled with more than silence. But outside, the night was not quiet. The storm raged, snow beating against the shutters. In the distance, faint lights moved on the mountain, road like lanterns swaying in the dark. The man frowned, moving to the window. Few ever traveled this way, especially in winter, but someone was out there. He pulled the curtain closed quickly, his heart uneasy. Behind him, the widow whispered, "They will come." Her voice made his blood run cold. He turned sharply. "Who?" She did not meet his eyes, only stroked her children's hair. "They always come, to take what is not theirs." The man felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. He sat heavily on the chair by the fire, watching the woman as she clung to her children. Her words echoed in his mind. Who were they? What danger had walked into his home along with her? The firelight flickered across her face, showing both her beauty and her sorrow. Her eyes lifted once more, locking on his. "If you turn us out tomorrow, I will not hate you," she said, softly. "But if you keep us, you must be ready to fight for us." He did not answer, his throat too tight. Instead, he leaned back, staring at the flames, the crackling wood sounding like distant drums of war. Upstairs, his bed remained empty. On the floor near the fire, the widow and her children slept in a small pile of warmth, and the man sat awake through the long night, haunted by her words, aware that strangers in his house had brought not only hunger and hope, but also danger he could not yet see. When dawn broke, pale light seeping through the shutters, the man still had not slept. He looked at the three figures curled together, and he knew with heavy certainty life would never be the same again. The storm faded by morning, leaving the world outside. Buried in white silence, the man pushed the cabin door open, snow spilling inside. The widow and her children stirred, blinking at the cold light that poured through the doorway. The man stepped out, his boots sinking deep. The valley below stretched, out under the pale sun, quiet, almost peaceful. But peace never lasted long here. He had no choice but to go to the village. Food was running low, wood was short, and now, with 3 more mouths to feed, he could not hide away. He glanced back at the woman, still clutching, her children inside. "Stay here," he said firmly. "Do not open the door for anyone but me." She nodded, her eyes full of worry. The road to the village was long, lined with frozen trees. Every step echoed in the silence, every breath misted in the air. By the time he reached the small cluster of stone houses, villagers were already gathering outside the market stalls. They turned when they saw him, some nodding in greeting, others frowning. He rarely came down from his cabin, and his sudden visit drew eyes. He traded for bread, salt, and dried meat, his hands moving fast, his words short, but whispers followed. Him. 2 men leaned close to one another, their voices low. "Did you hear? He took something into his cabin last night." "A woman, with children," another muttered. "Not his kind. Not human." The words spread like sparks on dry wood, carried from one mouth to another. By the time he left the market, he could feel the weight of stares burning into his back. Some looked at him with disgust, others with curiosity, a few with envy. The man tightened his jaw, ignoring them. But deep inside, he knew the storm inside the village was worse than the one that had howled outside his cabin. When he returned home, he found the widow pacing near the fire, her children curled in blankets. Her eyes widened when she saw his face. "They know," he said simply, placing the food on the table. Her hands trembled. "Then it begins," she whispered. He frowned. "What begins?" But she only shook her head, clutching her children closer. "They will not forgive you for opening your door to me," she said, her voice shaking. "Not your kind, not mine. Neither side wants us together." That night the children ate until their cheeks were round with bread, and their mother watched them with tears in her eyes. The man tried to pretend nothing had changed, but outside, shadows gathered near the road. Figures moved in the dark, pausing, staring toward the cabin, then vanishing again. He told himself it was only his imagination, yet the widow's words echoed in his mind. The next morning the whispers grew louder. A neighbor came up the mountain with firewood and stopped at the edge of the clearing. "You've taken her in," he said sharply, his eyes narrowing. "Do you know what that means?" The man said nothing, only stacked the wood inside. But the neighbor's voice carried like venom. "She will bring trouble to us all. Those children are not yours, and when the enforcers come, they will punish you too." The widow heard him. Through the door, her hands shaking as she pulled her children back into the shadows. Later, when the man sat by the fire, she whispered, "I told you. They will not let us live quietly." But it was not only fear that filled her voice, it was shame. She looked down at her hands, at the scars across her wrists, and murmured, "They see me as nothing, only property left behind after war, not a wife, not a mother, only a burden." The man clenched his fists, anger rising in his chest. "You are not nothing," he said firmly, "and they will not touch you while you are under my roof." The children stirred, calling softly in their alien tongue, and the widow bent to soothe them, but her eyes lifted to his, filled with both gratitude and fear. "You cannot fight them all," she whispered. "Even a human cannot stand against the law forever." Outside, the wind carried voices, distant but clear. "They say he keeps her like a wife," one voice muttered, "or like a slave." Another sneered. The man's hands gripped the table, his knuckles white. The whispers of the village had reached his door, and soon they would become shouts. That night, as he tried to rest by the fire, the widow moved quietly across the room. She spread a blanket near him and lay down with her children close. In the glow of the flames, she whispered words that almost broke him. "You should not have chosen us," she said softly. "But if you did, then you must not let go." The man closed his eyes, sleep refusing to come. For the first time, his cabin did not feel like a safe refuge, but like the center of a storm about to break. And far away, in the dark beyond the village, other footsteps marched closer, carrying orders not of whispers but of chains. The days after the whispers were not quiet. The man felt the change every time he walked into the village. Every time he passed the narrow streets, eyes followed him, voices hushed when he drew near, then rose again when his back was turned. He had lived among these people for years, but now he was a stranger to them, not because of what he had done, but because of who he had chosen to shelter. The widow noticed it too. She rarely left the cabin, spending her time near the fire with her children. Sometimes she stared at the door for long minutes, as if expecting it to burst open at any moment. Her hands trembled when the wind knocked against the shutters. At night she whispered to her children in her alien tongue, singing old songs so they would not hear the fear in her voice. One morning, before the sun had fully risen, heavy boots crushed the snow outside the cabin. The man stiffened, his hand on the axe leaning near the wall. The widow's face went pale as she gathered her children close. A fist pounded on the door, shaking it on its hinges. "Open," a harsh voice commanded. "By order of the enforcers, open this door." The man opened it slowly, his jaw tight. 4 men stood outside, wrapped in heavy coats, their belts heavy with weapons. One stepped forward, his eyes sharp and cold. "You've taken in a widow and her spawn," he said flatly. "You know they belong to the state, not to you." The widow whimpered behind him, clutching her children tighter. The man's chest burned with anger. "They belong to no one but themselves," he said, his voice steady. The enforcer sneered. "You think your cabin is above the law? Humans may be strong, but rules are stronger. Hand them over." The children whimpered, hiding their faces in their mother's cloak. The widow fell to her knees, her voice cracking as she cried out, "Please, please don't take them, don't take my babies. I will give myself to you, just let them stay. I will warm your beds, serve you, do anything, only spare my children." Her words cut the air like knives. The man felt his blood boil. He stepped forward, blocking her with his body. His voice thundered through the cabin. "No one touches them, not while I live." The enforcers laughed, the sound cruel and sharp. "You? 1 man against 4? You would die for them?" The man's grip tightened on the axe, his eyes never leaving theirs. "I would," he said simply, "and I will." The room fell into silence for a moment, broken only by the sound of the fire crackling. The enforcers shifted uneasily, for, though they outnumbered him, something in his voice made them hesitate. Finally, the leader spat on the ground. "Enjoy your delusion, human, but you cannot fight the state forever. We will return, and when we do, not even your strength will save you." They turned and left, boots crunching in the snow, their shadows fading into the trees. The man slammed the door shut, his breath ragged. The widow clung to his back, her tears wetting his shirt. "You cannot fight them," she whispered, her voice broken. "They will come with more, and they will not stop until they own us again." The man turned and cupped her face gently. Her eyes were wide, shimmering with fear and despair. "You are not theirs," he said firmly. "You and your children belong to no one but yourselves, and as long as I stand, they will not take you." The widow sobbed, falling against his chest, her body trembling with both fear and relief. Her children pressed against his legs, their small hands clutching his clothes, as if he were already their father. The fire flickered, casting their shadows high against the walls, 4 figures bound together not by blood but by choice. That night the man could not sleep. He sat with the axe across his knees, watching the flames burn low. Every howl of the wind sounded like footsteps. Every crack of ice outside sounded like a weapon being drawn. He knew the enforcers would return, not with 4 men, but with 10, maybe more. And when they came, He would have to decide if his cabin would become a fortress or a grave. The widow lay near the fire with her children, whispering soft words in her alien tongue. At last she looked up at him, her eyes red from crying. "You should not have chosen us," she said again, her voice fragile. "But you did, and now we are yours, body and soul." Her words carried both devotion and despair, a vow and a warning. The man stared at her, his chest heavy with the weight of her plea. He had not asked for this, but fate had placed it at his door. And now, shadow or no shadow, he could not turn away. Outside, the night deepened, the trees groaned under the weight of snow, and far in the valley, torches flickered. The enforcers were not gone, not truly. They were waiting, gathering, sharpening their blades. The shadow of threat had only just begun. The days that followed were heavy with silence. The man worked outside, chopping wood, carrying water, pretending life was normal. But inside, his mind was never calm. Every sound in the forest made him grip his axe tighter. Every flicker of shadow made him glance toward the door. The widow felt it too, her eyes never leaving her children, her hands trembling whenever the wind struck the cabin walls. One night, when the moon was hidden by clouds, the silence finally broke. The man heard it first, a crunch of boots in the snow, not one pair but many. He rose to his feet, his axe already in hand. The widow's breath caught. She clutched her children and whispered in terror, "They've come!" The door shook as fists pounded against it, stronger than before. "By the order of the state, open this door!" a voice thundered. The man stood still, his chest burning. He looked back at the widow, her eyes wide with tears, her children clinging to her. This was the choice. There was no more time. He lifted the heavy wooden beam that barred the door, his voice steady but low. "Stay back from the fire, keep them safe," he told her. The widow nodded, pressing her children into the shadows, whispering soft words to calm them, though her own voice shook with fear. The door burst open, the wood splintering under force. Torches spilled firelight into the cabin. Men stepped in, more than before, armored in thick coats, weapons gleaming. In the dark, the leader sneered. "You had your chance, human, now we take what belongs to us." The man's grip tightened on his axe, his jaw set. "They don't belong to you," he growled. "Not while I breathe." The enforcers laughed cruelly, spreading out, their boots heavy on the floor. One moved toward the widow, her children screaming as she tried to shield them. The man roared, swinging the axe in a wide arc. The steel bit deep into the man's shoulder, sending him crashing against the wall. The cabin exploded into chaos. Torches waved wildly, shadows twisting across the walls. The children cried out, the widow's voice rising in desperate screams. The man fought like a beast, every swing of the axe driven by fury. Two men rushed him at once, blades flashing. He ducked low, slamming his shoulder into one and driving him into the fire. The flames roared as the man screamed, his clothes igniting, filling the air with smoke. The leader drew a pistol, aiming straight at the widow. The man's eyes locked on the weapon, his blood turning cold. He hurled his axe, the blade spinning through the air. It struck the leader's arm, the pistol firing wild into the roof. Splinters raining down, the widow dragged her children away, clutching them tightly as sparks showered the room. The fight raged. The man grabbed a broken chair leg, swinging it like a club, cracking skulls, breaking bones. Blood stained the floor, mixing with snow blown in from the open door. He fought with no thought of survival, only of shielding the small voices crying behind him. The widow screamed his name, though she had never spoken it before that night. The sound gave him strength. One enforcer lunged from the side. Blade cutting across the man's ribs, he cried out but did not fall. With a roar, he seized the attacker by the throat and slammed him against the wall until he went still. Pain seared his body. His vision blurred, but he would not stop. At last, only two remained, dragging their wounded leader back toward the door. Their eyes burned with hatred, but also fear. "This isn't over." The leader spat, clutching his bleeding arm. "The state will not forget this, human. We will return with an army." The man staggered forward, his chest heaving, his shirt soaked with blood. "Then I'll be waiting," he growled, his voice like iron. The enforcers fled into the night, their torches vanishing into the snow. The cabin was left in ruin. Chairs shattered, blood spattered across the floor, smoke curling from the fire. The man collapsed to his knees, his breath ragged. The widow rushed to him, her hands clutching his face, her tears falling fast. "You're bleeding," she cried. "You'll die if you don't rest." He shook his head weakly, his eyes locking on hers. "They didn't take you," he whispered. "That's what matters." Her hands trembled as she pressed her forehead against his. "You fool," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You didn't just save us. You became ours." Her children crawled closer, their small hands clutching at his arm, calling him father in their tongue. He felt their warmth, their trembling bodies pressed to him. For the first time in years, he was not alone. But outside, the snow carried away the tracks of men, and somewhere in the valley drums of war began to beat. The fight was won, but the war was only beginning. The choice he made tonight, fire and blood, had marked him forever. The cabin smelled of smoke and blood. The floor was streaked with red, the fire burned low, and the man sat slumped against the wall, his body trembling from pain. The widow knelt beside him, pressing cloth against the wound along his ribs. Her silver hair falling over her face as she worked. Her children clung to her skirts, their wide eyes full of fear. Yet in that moment, the cabin felt alive in a way it never had before. Not silent, not lonely, but full of voices, cries, whispers, and the beating of hearts. The man groaned as she tightened the cloth. "You should rest," the widow whispered, her hands gentle, but firm. "You gave more blood than any man should." He shook his head, eyes burning with exhaustion but also resolve. "They'll be back," he muttered. "Not just a few men next time. An army." Her hands froze, her breath sharp. She knew he was right. The night passed with little sleep. Every creak of wood sounded like an enemy's step. Every howl of the wind like a battle cry. The widow kept close to him. Her children curled, between them like small shields. At dawn, the world outside was silent, snow covering the tracks of blood and boots, erasing the proof of what had happened. But the silence did not bring peace, only the promise of more to come. By midday, the villagers came. They gathered at the edge of the clearing, whispering among themselves, afraid to approach. Some looked at the cabin with pity, others with hatred. A bold voice rose from the crowd. "You've brought danger to all of us, human. They will come for you, and when they do, they will come for us too." The man stood in the doorway, blood still staining his shirt, his axe heavy in his hand. "Then let them come," he said, his voice rough but strong. "If you fear them, run. But I will not hand over a mother and her children to chains," the villagers muttered, some turning away in shame, others in anger. But none stepped forward to help. The man knew then that he stood alone, except for the 3 souls waiting. Inside that night, as the fire crackled, the widow sat across from him, her eyes filled with both sorrow and light. "You should not have chosen us," she whispered again, though this time her voice was softer, almost like a prayer. "But you did, and now you are ours. If they come again, we will stand with you." Her children nodded, their small voices calling him father, the word trembling but full of hope. The man felt a warmth spread in his chest, deeper than any fire could give. He looked at them, the family he had never asked for, the family that had knocked on his door one frozen night, and he realized he would die for them, without hesitation, not because of pity, not because of duty, but because they were his now, chosen, not born, bound by fire and blood. Days passed, each one heavy with waiting. The widow began to help with the cabin, her hands skilled at mending, her voice soft as she sang to her children. The man watched them, and with each passing day the loneliness in his heart shrank, replaced by something dangerous and beautiful. Hope. But hope could not erase the truth. The enforcers had promised to return, and promises like that were never broken. The man sharpened his axe each night, the sound of stone against steel echoing through the cabin like a warning. The widow would watch him, her eyes shining with both fear and pride. "You are not just a human anymore," she told him once. "You are our shield, our fire. One evening, when the sky turned red with sunset, the widow came to him, her hands trembling. She knelt beside his chair, her children asleep by the fire. Her voice broke as she whispered, "I offered myself to you because I thought it was the only way to save them. But now, I offer myself because I cannot see my life without you. You are not just their father now, you are mine too." The man's breath caught, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at her, at the tears glistening in her eyes, at the firelight dancing on her silver hair. Slowly he reached out, his rough hand brushing against hers. "You don't have to give yourself to me," he whispered, his voice shaking. But she shook her head firmly. "I already have." The cabin seemed to glow warmer, not just from the fire, but from something greater. A family born in the ashes of war, forged in the cold of winter, bound by a human's choice to open his door. Outside, the valley slept under snow. But far away in the darkness, armies stirred, blades sharpened, torches lit. The storm was not over. It was only waiting. Yet inside the cabin, by the crackling fire, a new storm had risen. A storm made of love, of defiance, of fire and blood. And no power in the world could easily break it.